So as Bernard said, I'm here thanks to the funding and the initiative of three bodies, which is my own home university, KU Leuven. Then the FWO is the Fund for Scientific Research in Belgium that has paid for my plane tickets of coming here. And then the last one is EDGE, which is the Theory, Criticism and History group within the School of Architecture at University of Queensland, where I've been a visiting scholar for the past 4 weeks, which was really a great thing to do. I'm very grateful to everyone involved. So my talk this afternoon is, as Bernard has said, on a very specific action undertaken by Fr Werenfried Van Straten, which is more or less at the basis of Aid to the Church in Need, as you know it today. The image you see there is a cover of a journal, an academic journal that is published in Belgium once a year, and in which I published a quite extensive paper on the topic of the chapel drugs. I'll give you the details at the end of my talk. What I present here is a sort of summary of what's discussed more at length in that journal article. Good. In the aftermath of the Second World War, between 12 and 14 million Germans residing in Central Europe were expelled from their homes. This involuntary exodus significantly altered the religious landscape of post-war Germany, for several millions of Catholics established themselves in areas that had been Protestant since the Reformation in the 16th century. The miserable sort of these expellees attracted the attention of a wide range of Catholic charities, and one such organization was, as we call it in Dutch, Oostpriesterhulp. In English, that would be the Eastern Priests Relief Organization. There's been various names, but this was the one you would mostly find in the English literature, the Eastern Priests Relief Organization. It was founded, as you all know, in Belgium by the charismatic Premonstratensian Fr Werenfried Van Straten. And initially, it assisted the Catholic priests in the German diaspora, but gradually broadened its scope to assisting all Catholics worldwide suffering from repression, discrimination, or in pastoral need, as Bernard has explained. As you all know, today, Aid to the Church in Need, as the organization is called since 1969, is perhaps one of the largest Catholic charities worldwide. So in this talk this afternoon, I want to shed light on the phenomenon of international Catholic charity after the Second World War, and on ACN in particular. And the paper focuses in particular on one of its founding and perhaps also most emblematic actions, namely the so-called chapel truck mission. From 1950 onwards, each year during the summer season, a convoy of trailer coaches, as you can see them there, a convoy of trailer coaches converted into mobile chapels and loaded with gifts and food would travel into Germany and visit the isolated Catholics in the diaspora. And my paper discusses in particular how Van Straten managed to transform this major pastoral and logistical problem into a captivating project that left no one untouched. And to this effect, I look at a chapel truck action from 3 angles. In the first place, as a prime example of the mobilizing force of Catholic charity in the aftermath of the Second World War. In the second place, as a particular form of Christian mission in the context of the Cold War. And in the third place, as an early example of itinerant worshipping infrastructure for an increasingly mobile society. As you all know, the Second World War officially ended with the famous conference at Potsdam, the Potsdam Conference in July 1945, where the future of Germany in particular was discussed by these 3 gentlemen. You see Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin. And in the declaration that was published after that conference, it says that, and I quote, "The 3 governments, meaning the USA, the UK, and Russia, the victors of the war, recognize that the transfer to Germany of German populations, or elements thereof, remaining in Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary, will have to be undertaken. They agree that any transfer has to take place and should be effected in an orderly and humane manner." I hope you see the irony in that statement. And this one little phrase set in motion more than 12 million Germans across the British and American sectors. And the question of these so-called displaced persons, which is the word that was used and still is used in diplomatic circles to describe these people. So this issue of the displaced persons would become, of course, a central issue in German politics for the years to come, since almost 2/3 of the Germans were now concentrated on only half of the country's original pre-war surface. Housing this new population constituted, of course, a major challenge, because over 5 million dwellings were needed in the short term. And as a consequence, millions of refugees had to take residence in provisional barracks, often sharing this provisory accommodation with 30 or more other people. Structural unemployment further aggravated the situation, as most of the ex-police were accommodated in rural areas where the job opportunities were scarce. And very quickly it became clear that if these people were left to their fates, all would soon be over with Germany. As one author noted, the country constituted a veritable time bomb in the very heart of Europe, and this both in the economic and social sense of the word. And amongst these refugees, there were approximately 6 million Catholics, establishing themselves in predominantly Protestant regions. The Catholic leaders, and the Vatican in particular, realized that the intellectual and the spiritual starvation of these people might lead to religious indifference, de-Christianization, but foremost to political radicalization, both to the left, meaning communism, or to the right, meaning nationalism. This meant, in fact, that not only the Germans were in peril, but in fact also the Christian church in the largest country of Europe. Political and religious leaders alike believed, however, that if the refugees could be manipulated by the propaganda of either communists or nationalist elements, they would also be receptive, possibly, to moderate bodies such as, for example, the Catholic Church, provided the Church managed to establish a close contact with the refugees at a local level. That was easier said than done, however. In the Soviet zone, for example, there were only 600 Catholic priests for a couple of million Catholics. Carrying with them all the items necessary to celebrate Mass, these so-called rucksack priests, and Bernard has referred to them in the introduction, these rucksack priests traveled great distances to meet their flock. Flirting with exhaustion, they read Mass in the most improbable of settings, serving not only the ex-police, but also sharing their poverty and hardships. Overwhelmed by the scale and the urgency of the problem, German religious leaders called upon all sorts of organizations and institutions for help. The Vatican, for example, sent relief missions to each of the 3 Western zones. And numerous other charities also set in motion all kinds of actions. In Belgium and the Netherlands in particular, one organization arose that has become planted, and I can assure you it's true, it has become planted in the collective memory of an entire generation, namely Oostpriesterhulp, how it was originally called, or again in English, the Eastern Priests Relief Organization. On Christmas Day 1947, after a very quick visit to Germany, which is, as you probably know, only 50 kilometers away from where he was living, the young Dutch Premonstratensian Fr Werenfried Van Straten published an article in his abbé's newsletter. Alluding to the miserable conditions of the birth of Christ, he was entitled, "Peace on Earth, No Room at the Inn." Drawing on the fact that a human disaster was taking place not even 100 kilometers away, Van Straten pleaded for reconciliation with the former enemy and appealed for help for the German refugees. To this effect, he urged his fellow Catholics to donate food and clothing as a tangible sign of Christian charity. In his conclusion, he called for action, and I quote, "We must go east. Trucks must be staffed with priests and filled with gifts, and make a tour from village to village across the vast districts. We must celebrate Mass, preach and distribute with hands plenty of what the love of the Christian West has brought together." And although the war wounds were still gaping, Van Straten's appeal, which was relayed by over 35 local newspapers, triggered an impressive wave of generosity among the Catholic community in the Low Countries. One day, for example, after one of his very many sermons, Van Straten asked the farmers' wives to donate, and I quote, "a not too small piece of bacon, in order for it to be sent to the starving refugee priests in Germany." Much to his surprise, by the end of the week, more than 1 ton of bacon had been collected. And so soon the so-called bacon operation spread out all over Flanders. Within a couple of months, more than 50 tons of meat was sent to over 2,500 priests in the diaspora. And as you can imagine, this action firmly established Van Straten's epithet as bacon priests as a household name in Flanders. And he's still known by that name by most of the people there. And this was the beginning only of a very impressive array of all sorts of actions, and each geared towards a specific branch of Catholic society. For example, classes of school children would adopt a particular priest and send cardboards with foodstuff to Germany in exchange for letters with updates about his work. For the preparatory school children, there was the so-called candy action. Then the women's organizations busied themselves collecting old textile, the youth movements collected old paper, the farmers' union made a massive collection of butter, and so on. Soon, Van Straten's organization took the veritable dimension of a popular movement. Donating became almost a civic duty in Flanders. That's at least what my parents told me. Preaching at a pace of over 60 speeches a month, his personality, I mean Van Straten's personality, also had a magnetic effect upon benefactors. By the mid-1950s, Van Straten had become a figure of international allure. Witness his portrait, as you can see here, on the cover of Der Spiegel in 1954, and Der Spiegel is a very important national magazine in Germany. In the meantime, his organization had developed branches in all the neighboring countries, including Germany, France, and so on, and had set up its headquarters in the seminary for refugee priests in Königstein near Frankfurt, where it is still today. Despite the overwhelming success of his actions, Van Straten soon realized that sending food and material help to Germany only addressed the humanitarian aspect of the diaspora. The pastoral problem remained unsolved, in fact. Not only was there still an insufficient number of priests, they also had to cover very large distances, as the parishes often included over 30 villages. With his typical drive, Van Straten devised a pragmatic solution to this logistic challenge. He bought a number of disused trailer coaches from the Dutch railways and had them converted into mobile chapels. They were 40 meters long, and these so-called Kapellenwagen, chapel trucks in English, contained separate areas for storing goods, for worshipping, and also living quarters for the two accompanying priests. The chapel area, which you see here in the middle, could be opened up by means of two large doors that together formed a sort of altarpiece. And so every truck had a different set of paintings forming the altarpiece, in relation also with the name of the chapel truck. Every chapel truck was named after one saint, was Saint Bonifacius, and so on. So the chapel area could open up by means of two large doors, and it was separated from the rest of the van simply by a backlot behind which a confessional was installed. Further, a canopy could be attached to the outside of the van. I'll show you a picture of that later on, offering a shelter for approximately 100 worshippers. And thus the chapel trucks resolved, in fact, three problems at once. One, the lack of worshipping infrastructure. Two, the transportation of gifts to Germany. And three, the shortage of priests. By putting modern forms of transportation to the use of charity and mission, the chapel truck action continued, in fact, a long tradition of portable worshipping infrastructure in the context of mission and war. For example, in the late 19th century, the Catholic Church Extension Society of America used converted train coaches to celebrate Mass in the tiny frontier towns, distributing the Eucharist from the back of such cars. What distinguished the chapel truck action from this and other similar initiatives, however, is Van Straten's understanding that beyond their practical utility and pastoral relevance, the large chapel trucks possessed a symbolic potential and a visual appeal that could be capitalized on. The heavy trucks indeed flawlessly embodied the much desired image of a tenacious, united, and modern church. And this was probably best illustrated by the yearly blessing of all the chapel trucks prior to their departure on Easter Day in Königstein, where the entire fleet gathered in the large inner courtyard of the ACN headquarters. As you can see here, this is quite an impressive image. All these trucks united. They were in fact stored in Netherlands. So that's what you see on the map, on the top right. See the one chapel truck coming from Holland to Königstein, because they were maintained in Holland in the winter season. They would collectively move to Königstein, blessed, and then each go to their own diocese in Germany. Recorded in numerous photographs, these images were published widely, with ominous captions such as, and I quote, "These churches on wheels must fill even the worst enemy of faith with awe." The Chapel Truck action kicked off simultaneously in the cities of Ghent and Utrecht in Belgium and Holland in 1950 with 2 prototypes, and it grew at an exponential rate. In 1951, for example, there were already 12 trucks on the road, making 514 stops across 12 dioceses. And at the peak of the Chapel Truck action, which was approximately 1954-55, there were 164 missionaries from 19 different countries, driving 26 trucks to entire Germany. They would hold 7,000 sermons, distribute 250 tons of relief goods, and in total, that year they would reach 137,000 Catholics. So these are really impressive figures. By then, I mean mid-1950s, posters announcing the Chapel Truck is coming to a village had become a familiar sight throughout Germany. And all this was made possible through gifts and donations, mainly from Holland and Belgium, where the entire Catholic network became involved. Just as an example, the Catholic Boy Scouts of Deense, which is a tiny town in the middle of Belgium, financed a truck of its own. So they managed to collect that much money that they could finance a truck of their own, which was then baptized Saint Popo in honor of their own patron. The Chapel Truck missions were carefully prepared and very well organized in an almost military fashion. They always followed a fixed scenario. They were staffed by a driver who was himself often a former refugee. There were always 2 priests, always 1 German, always 1 foreign, and generally they were members of the regular orders. And the trucks were on the road from mid-April, more or less, to mid-October, halting twice a week in a different settlement. And as you can well imagine, the arrival of these imposing trucks formed a welcome distraction for the isolated Catholic refugees and was generally greeted with great enthusiasm. Armed with a list of all Catholic families in the area, both priests would then set out for a visit at home. And generally much appreciated, this intense contact with the faithful also had a strategic purpose. It allowed for a close monitoring of the religious zeal, which was recorded in great detail and sent to the headquarters in Königstein as resource material for future missions. The culminating point of each visit was the celebration of Holy Mass, which was held in any available church or parish hall, which often even belonged to the evangelical community. Recorded sounds of bells would be broadcast from the loudspeakers on the roof of the truck, where the priests would wait for the procession to pick them up and guide them to the church. Upon departure later that day, the trucks were decorated with flowers and garlands, while children would run along with the vehicle until it speeded up. And this atmosphere of joy, which you see depicted in that image, it illustrates an important side effect of these missions. It boosted the pride and the self-consciousness of the Catholic minorities, as for a couple of days at least, they had formed the center of attention, confirmed in their hopes that the Church had not given up on them. And so it is that already in a 1952 report, the Eastern Priest Relief Organization was able to congratulate itself with the success of the Chapel Truck action, since several dioceses apparently were asking for follow-up missions. The action was also publicly recognized by the highest church dignitaries, such as the Belgian Archbishop Van Rooij, his Dutch colleague de Jong, and even Pope Pius XII himself expressed his enthusiasm in a letter to the German episcopacy. And 2 years later, as you can see here on the image, Van Straten was received in private audience at Castel Gandolfo, which is the private residence of the Pope in Rome, and together with the papal blessing of a couple of traveling chapels in front of St. Peter's, this, as you can well imagine, marked the climax of the Chapel Truck action. So this is in 1956, if I'm not mistaken. However, there's also a flip side to this image. These public adulations were not only meant to glorify the success of the initiative, they also served to refute the slumbering criticism on the organization and its founder. For example, some stated that the actions were arbitrary, ill-considered sometimes, and that the success of the chapel trucks primarily had to do with their novelty, with the spectacle they offered, and of course the free distribution of food and clothing. So in their view, the action capitalized somehow on a confusion between spiritual and material aid. Responding to this growing demand to explain and justify his organization's goals, Van Straten started to publish a bi-monthly newsletter from 1954 onwards. It was edited in 7 languages with a very, very large circulation, and it formed, and I guess somehow still forms, the cornerstone of the organization's propaganda and the basis for its fundraising. Amongst its regular features was a column called News from the Church's Frontier, a chronicle that reported on the miserable situation of Catholics behind the Iron Curtain, and it decried, for example, how the East German youth was forbidden to adhere to Christian youth movements in the communist regime. And further, the newsletter also featured detailed, diary-like accounts of the chapel truck action, emphasizing the heroic and missionary character of these operations through text and images. And there's a quote that I want to read that I took from one of the newsletters that describes the scene that I've just talked about earlier, when the moment where the chapel truck leaves the village. It's quite, well, it's written with some pathos, but it's nice to hear. Anyway, I quote, "Roaring and stamping, a diesel engine is warming up. The driver is already behind the wheel, monitoring the pressure gauge of the vacuum brake system. 2 priests are still in conversation with people who regard them with something of expectation in their eyes. Their smiling faces hide the pain all seem to feel. A baby on the arm of the mother is blessed. With a wide gesture, a man gets a tough shoulder hit. Now 1 priest has boarded and sits beside the driver. The other one is still in front of the truck. Upon him clasping his hands, all kneel closely around him. He blesses them slowly and emphatically. Many faces are now wet with tears. At the moment the truck drives off, the children still run part of the way with the truck. The big ones remain still and feel lonesome." It's difficult not to be touched by this, right? Yeah. The graphic design of the newsletter, as you can see on these images, further stimulated this direct emotional appeal. The pages were structured by catchwords and titles in large characters, and featured dramatic black and white pictures of mothers, children, elderly people struck by poverty and moral desolation. The editorial in the first issue, quite tellingly entitled, "Is There Still a Need for the Eastern Priest Relief Organization?" featured, for example, a picture by the well-known Dutch photographer Martin Coppens of a crying toddler stretching his arms towards the reader. Rather than illustrating what was being said in the texts, because often there was no relation, this powerful visual rhetoric aimed directly at the reader's compassion, aversion, or pride. Despite its triumphant start, the original focus of the chapel truck action on the distribution of food, clothing, and books quickly became superseded, as the ex-police also started to benefit from what we call in German the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic boom, the economic recovery of Germany in the early 1950s. Most men found employment, while the increasing standard of living became clear, for example, in the great number of new church buildings that arose everywhere. For Van Straten, this did not mean that his organization had become obsolete, however. Quite the contrary. He broadened its scope and he broadened its scope and called upon his fellow Christians as God's elite, with the duty to pass the Lord's inheritance to the future generations. And in the light of this apostolic ambition, the chapel truck action can also be approached as a particular form of Christian mission. And now comes a little theoretical part in the paper, because in the paper I distinguish 3 paradigms of Christian mission. There's a confessional paradigm, the revivalist, and the ideological. And interestingly, these 3 categories allow to chart the evolution in scope of the chapel truck action. The first paradigm, which was the confessional, the confessional mission paradigm, is based on an alleged dichotomy between true and false Christians, and has inspired Protestants and Catholics alike to target each other's territories for many centuries. The same is true for Van Straten when he wrote, and I quote, "Looking back, the expulsion of the Germans, that is, the expulsion can be acknowledged as God's instrument to alter the condition of the diaspora," end quote. Suggesting that the re-establishing of Catholic supremacy in the Protestant territories in Germany constituted no less than a divine order, he made clear here that the chapel trucks only constituted a first step towards a far greater goal. Indeed, as he stated further on, I quote, "Around these trucks blows the spirits of the universal church. They are the epiphany of a great, bold Christianity, baffling the Protestants with speechless admiration and quickening the heart of even the most solitary Catholic republics which regained Christian pride," end quote. In Van Straten's imagination, the chapel truck action thus picked up the threads where the Crusades had left it in the Middle Ages. The second revivalist missionary paradigm is based on a dichotomy between serious and nominal Christianity. The principal aim here is the awakening of nominal Christians or the reconversion of lapsed ones. In this context, the chapel trucks also had a role to play, since statistics revealed how the general increase in welfare in Germany caused a severe downfall in religious adherence. Already in 1954, it was found that the percentage of communion had dropped from 90 to 50%. The chapel trucks therefore no longer solely addressed the ex-police and the refugees, but all Catholic Germans with the aim to foster their religious zeal. Thus, from the mid-1950s on, the chapel trucks increasingly complemented existing pastoral care. To this effect, they halted longer in one place. They would stay, for example, an entire week rather than a couple of days, which allowed more time to hear people's confessions, provide catechetic instruction for the youth, and follow up the faithful in their good intentions. The intensity of the mission remained intact, however. In 1962, for example, the missionaries held no less than 4,500 sermons. They heard 19,000 confessions and reached a total audience of almost 70,000 people. Whereas the roots of the two previous missionary paradigms date back, you could say, to the 19th century or even earlier, the last type that I want to discuss, which I call the ideological mission, is a clearly 20th century phenomenon, for it refers in particular to communism. Communism, as you all know, that rejected religion as a basis for moral judgment. Especially after the 1956 uprising in Hungary, the struggle against communism became the central theme in the third and last phase of the chapel truck action. Producing an endless stream of articles and statements, Van Straten depicted communism as an inhumane collectivist system with a total disregard for mankind. His fanatic stance against communism explains why he further broadened the scope of his organization to include also the persecuted and oppressed Christian churches behind the Iron Curtain. With hindsight, and it's my duty as an academic to be critical, it is questionable, however, whether such fear for communism's appeal to the refugees was really justified. In fact, already in 1949, Cardinal Frings, which was the most important Catholic prelate at that time, Frings already announced that, quite triumphantly, that the ex-police and the refugees had not chosen communism, but were embracing Catholicism instead. So why then did the belief in the potential for radicalization remain so persistent? One reason may reside precisely in the lack of familiarity amongst Western leaders with the ex-police and the refugees and their political views. It seemed only logical for them to assume that the millions of refugees and ex-police would turn to political radicalism in response to their misery. Conveniently overlooking the fact that most of them had precisely run away from communism and totalitarian regimes, they perhaps exaggerated the danger to gain attention and assistance. This somehow also applies to Van Straten. Somehow capitalizing on the culture of fear that surrounded the Cold War in the 1950s, he increasingly relied on apocalyptic imagery and alleged complot theories in warning his fellow Catholics not to renounce their faith and support his organization. Apart from its significance as a typical instance of Christian charity and its role as an ideological vehicle in the context of the Cold War, the chapel truck action also ties in with a third central theme in the Catholic discourse during the post-war era, namely the question of how to organize pastoral care in an increasingly mobile society. No longer dictated by war or ideology, but by incentives related to work, leisure, or family, short and longer term migration such as commuting. All this created a new and dynamic pattern of settlement that became increasingly apparent in the decades after World War II, and especially towards the end of the 1950s, early 1960s. Hence the call by progressive Catholic sociologists for innovative forms of pastoral care adapted to a society characterized by change, movement, and dynamism. In opposition with the traditional territorial focus of Catholicism and the concept of the Church as a sacred monument built for eternity, the idea of a lightweight, ephemeral, and flexible infrastructure for the cult gained ground. This was not so much a fashionable idea than a necessity. As practicing Catholics were increasingly becoming a minority, they had to reach out. In a world in movement, the Church had to come towards the people instead of the other way around. In architectural terms, the idea of a church in movement led to reviving the old metaphor of the nomadic tent in reference to Moses' journey through the desert, an idea that was supported even by the highest church dignitaries, such as the progressive Italian Cardinal Lercaro in Bologna. Hence the appearance in the late 1960s of all sorts of mobile and ephemeral pastoral structures in campsites along the coast during the summer and worshiping places in the proximity of major traffic intersections at airports or in large train stations. Although born out of necessity rather than well-meditated principles, and essentially a pragmatic and improvised response to an emergency situation, the chapel trucks somehow seem to anticipate this call for what we call in French a retour aux sources, a return to first principles in terms of church construction. As shown in many photographic records, a simple canopy attached to the truck and a row of benches sufficed to demarcate a sphere of introspection, create an atmosphere of piety, and install a notion of community. I think you can very well see this on this picture, taken somewhere in Germany in the countryside, but it's really clear what is happening. It's not only religion that is being experienced there, it's a sense of community that is made possible through this very lightweight and mobile infrastructure. The photographs of such meetings possess a certain attractiveness in the sense that they seem to prefigure and embody the post-conciliar mantra after the Second Vatican Council that beyond the sacred building, it is this assembly of the faithful that constitutes the true Church of God. And this idea was carried to the extreme in 1969. I guess that's the year where everything was possible, flying to the moon, walking naked on the beach, everything seemed to be possible. And this proposition of a mobile church was carried to the extreme by a French-German architect, Hans Walter Müller, who is still alive. And on the occasion of the yearly festivities in his parish, which is Montigny-les-Cormeilles near Paris, he proposed an inflatable structure allowing 200 faithful to attend High Mass in a church that had taken only 7 minutes to build and had weighed only 39 kilograms. You can see it on the image on the far right. I'm showing this image just for the reason that coincidentally at the very same moment in 1969, the chapel truck action came to an end. In that year, 1969, only 4 trucks were sent out, carrying only 32 missionaries, 4 dioceses. This was clearly the end of the action. The program was abandoned. The trucks were shipped to Latin America and the Philippines. This is quite significant. The sending of the remaining chapel trucks to what was then becoming known as the Third World illustrates the exponential growth and the increasingly universal scope of the Eastern Priests Relief Organization during the 1960s. As Bernard told us in the beginning, it is also at the end of the 60s that it became established in Australia, for example. So by the end of the 1960s, the organization's mission had broadened to, and I quote, combating the forces that prevent Catholics from practicing their faith. I guess that's still pretty much the mission of the organization today. And this growing ambition became apparent in the new name that was introduced from 1969, Aid to the Church in Need. And the organization now ran operations all over the planet, realizing a turnover that equaled that of a major company. Still firmly directing the organization at that moment, Van Straten had become a very, very influential figure by then, both amongst the general public, but also amongst the highest ecclesiastical authorities. His popularity grew to such proportions that, as he pleased to state himself, that his benefactors, that's you amongst others, that his benefactors made up the largest parish of the Catholic world. His capacity to mobilize people gradually waned, nonetheless, towards the end of the 1960s. Whereas in 1956 he set up a campaign in support of the Hungarian Cardinal Joseph Micsinszki, who had been prosecuted and imprisoned by the communist regime, this action culminated in the reception of 7,000 Hungarian refugees in Belgium, who would be hosted by Belgian households. 10 years later, after the Soviet occupation of Prague in 1968, he again launched an appeal for solidarity, but contrary to 10 years earlier, it provoked almost no reaction at all from the Catholic side. That was quite surprising. And for Van Straten, this illustrated to an extent what he called the false prophets of left Catholicism, end quote, had managed to misguide the faithful in only 10 years' time. So therefore, when the Iron Curtain finally fell in 1989, he did not hesitate to revive the chapel truck mission, and he sent a new purpose-built coach to the former Easter Bloc. That's the one you see here. This is a press clipping where Fr Werenfried shows the new truck to the press. It was purposely built in Belgium. So this chapel truck was then sent to Prague, but the mission did not become the triumph that Van Straten had dreamed of, however. On its first stop in Prague, the mobile chapel was in fact greeted with reticence and, if not, indifference. Or, as one participating missionary noted, it was clear that the times had changed, and so had the chapel truck mission. It no longer addressed the herd, but the single lost sheep. Having finally managed to put his organization under papal authority during the 1960s, Van Straten became, in fact, virtually untouchable. His best-selling autobiography, They Call Me the Bacon Priest, added much to the mythical aura surrounding his person. This skillfully constructed sacrosanct image, in combination with his tendency to quite violently counter any critique on him or his organization, perhaps explains why up until now no significant academic research has been undertaken about the ideological backgrounds of this organization or Van Straten's impacts as the spokesman of the more conservative branch of Catholicism in Belgium and beyond. I must stress here, however, I think it's important to say that I myself, I have received full support from ACN. I went to the headquarters in Königstein. I had access to all the archives I wished, so I was really well welcomed. That is as a side note. And although the ideological, financial and political complexities of an organization of this size and ambition requires further scholarly attention, their alleged contradictions should not divert us from its initial aim, however. The chapel truck action in particular remains an impressive achievement that testifies to the power of one man to mobilize an entire society and provoke unprecedented waves of solidarity with the victims of war and persecution. Thank you.